Hello and welcome to the fourth revision video relating to USA, a nation of contrast, 1910 to 1929. Today we are going to be looking at the economic boom, key question 4. Now I would suggest, as I always do at this point, that you pause the video so that you can get these headings down. This is quite a big key question, so we're going to be looking at a lot today. We're going to be looking at America's economic position in 1910. We're going to be looking at its assets and natural resources, the impact of World War I, hire purchase, electrification, mass production, laissez-faire, and individualism and protectionism. Again, I'll stress, as I always do, don't just use this video as a mode of revision. Make sure that you're using your book, BBC Bitesize, any other resources you've got as well. So, this diagram quite nicely sums up the reason that there was an economic boom in America during this time, and it sort of covers all the things that we need to think about when discussing why it happened. So core goods, things like oil, coal, wood, plentiful in America, lots of raw materials to be found. The development of department stores, the convenience shopping, people able to buy things on demand when they wanted. The development of electricity, helping the factories, actually triggering a second industrial revolution in America. Mass productions, the ability to make things en masse, to make a lot of things at the same time. The development of advertising in the cinemas, in radio, in magazines, and newspapers, and then the ability to buy things on tick, hire purchase and credit, so the ability to buy something and pay for it over time. So, America's economic position in 1910, natural resources and cheap labour force. So the USA, as I've discussed previously, has an abundance of natural resources upon which its prosperity was built. Now, these natural resources had provided the foundation for the growth of the US economy previous to the First World War, and it stimulated more growth then in the 1920s. America had large coal fields in Kentucky and Pennsylvania and West Virginia, big oil reserves in California, Oklahoma and Texas. They had iron in Minnesota, lead, copper and zinc in the Rocky Mountains. The whole of the western region of the country is covered in large forests, so there's an abundance of wood available to them. And not only that, but because of immigration from Europe into the USA, there's an abundance of cheap, unskilled labour coming in from places like Germany, Scandinavia, Italy, Poland, Russia, Ireland, China, all these places. And these natural resources, as well as the cheap labour force, allowed America to expand its industry and provide people with more jobs. So the impact of the First World War. War, despite being a terrible thing and a cause of much suffering, quite often benefits economies, especially economies of the countries that are winning. America didn't actually join the First World War until 1917, but before that it had been providing arms or selling arms to Britain and France. So this didn't only help the munitions factories to make money, but it also helped the growth of industries like iron, steel and engineering as well. These countries also brought things like food, raw materials and munitions, so the agricultural industry in America grew as well. During the war as well, European countries are not able to sell their own exports because they've got other things going on. And so USA manufacturers and farmers take over their business. USA actually takes over from Germany at the end of the war to be the lead producer in fertilizer and chemicals. So by 1918, when the World War I is ending, the USA emerges from it basically unscathed. The country has not been touched, unlike much of Europe. It has lost 60,000 men, but when you compare this to the millions of British and French and Russian soldiers killed, it hasn't suffered on a scale that they have. Not only that, but Germany, having had to take responsibility for the war, have had war fines and reparations placed on them that they can't afford to pay. They borrow from America. So there's a triangle system going on with that as well, where America is making money from the interest because America is lending money to Germany, who are paying this money to Britain and France, who are then paying this money back to America because they own it. So the money going round in the European economy is America and always comes back to Americans. The war also stimulated technological advances in mechanization, as well as the development of things like plastics as well. And the USA now at this point leads the world in new technology. So the First World War has a great impact on the American economy and contributes greatly to the boom of the 1920s. And then we've got electrification. Electrification actually triggered another industrial revolution in America. It developed really slowly previous to the First World War, but the amount of it consumed had doubled in the 1920s. 16% of American people had electrically lit homes in 1912, but by 1927 this was 63%. By the end of the decade, nearly 70% of all Americans had all electric lights. More and more factories are being run by electricity. And again, as I've said, it doubles the amount of electricity being used. In 1926 as well, Hoover introduces the beats as it sweeps as it cleans vacuum cleaner, which cleverly incorporated the 3 established methods of cleaning carpet. And this basically set the standard then for the rest of the market to follow. The fridge was really important as well, because by 1900 half American houses were using an ice box to keep food cold, and that all changed when General Electric developed the first motor top unit in 1927, and this was the first fridge to be used over a large area. So electricity allowed these consumer products to be created and developed. Radios, gramophones, telephones, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, all these kinds of things were created because of electrification. And it was fundamental to development and technology. It provided cheaper, flexible form of power for factories and industries, and these industries, because of that, grew in turn. So electricity actually stimulated the growth of other industries as well as creating jobs in its own field. Lots of other factors as well that we're going to have a quick look at. The growth of the stock market. It became sort of part and parcel to dabble in stocks in the 1920s. They'd say even the shoeshine boy was dealing in shares. And they rose steadily throughout the decade and then really dramatically in 1928. So people actually made a lot of money from stocks in 1928. The average wage also increases by 8%. This leads to an increase in what we call consumerism. And basically, consumerism just means buying things that they probably wouldn't have been able to buy before. So consumer luxuries, things like the Hoover, things like radios, gramophones, things that people don't necessarily need but just want. And again, this leads to the development in advertising. The growth of credit makes it much easier to buy these consumer goods, even when they didn't have enough cash to pay for them immediately. They just pay for them in installments. One thing to emphasize, though, is there was no regulations on this. Anybody could get credit. And about half the goods sold in the 1920s are paid for by credit, paid for by hire purchase. A lot of American people then have got confidence in their economy as well, and they're prepared to buy goods, they're prepared to invest in companies, they're prepared to try out new ideas. Advertising, as I've just said, develops because of this. More and more firms start realising that advertising is the way to go. Magazines and newspapers are most important because they were the main way of getting them out to people. But the development in the cinema also provided new opportunities on the radio as well, as people were able to advertise that way too. The people who designed the advertisements would study the psychology of the consumer and devise methods they believe would encourage people to buy the products. Women quite often were the targets for advertisers. For instance, the Hoover, this idea that the woman was in the house during this time, housewife was the main occupation of women during this time, and so placing a woman on a poster with a Hoover would encourage women to buy them. Now, mass production as well, used in many industries in the 1920s, like household goods and textiles. It was the introduction of standard clothing sizes in the USA made it possible to standardize clothing and mass produce clothes as well. It was adopted by the car industry, and it speeds up industrial production and improved productivity. So basically, the mass production would be the production line. There'd be different people stood at different stages of the production line ready to put certain parts onto the product. It just sped things up, made it much easier to produce things and get them out. The development of department stores as well. More and more people buy these consumer goods from department stores. USA was actually the first country to have a supermarket. The Piggly Wiggly opened in Tennessee in 1916, and this is actually the first instance of customers helping themselves from the shelves. Previously, you would go in the same way that you would go into a butcher's today and ask for the meat, and the butcher would provide it for you. That is how all shops worked previous to this. And the supermarket was the first instance of you actually going in and thinking, right, I want this, and picking things off the shelves and paying at the end. The assembly line, as I've discussed, was super important as well. Developed by Henry Ford, and it was called the Magic Belt in 1913. The electric conveyor belt carried partially assembled cars at the same speed past workers. at the same who stood at the same spot and did a job such as fitting wheels, fitting doors. It saved a lot of time. And actually, the Ford factory in Detroit was producing a car every 3 minutes in 1913. By 1920, it was producing one every 20 seconds. So a car being produced every 20 seconds. And the car industry was very, very important as well. He wanted to produce a car that ordinary Americans could afford. He'd been making cars in small workshops and they were being assembled piece by piece. But by 1913, when the electric conveyor belt was brought in, this, as we've discussed, brought a huge change into the speed at which he could make the cars. What was the effect of this on the rest of America's industries? Well, he could bring the price of cars down and make them more affordable for many more Americans. So, for instance, in 1914, a Model T had cost $850. By 1926, it was $295. 27 million people have a car by 1929. This means that more people are getting in their cars, driving to hotels, driving to restaurants, driving to different parts of the country. So the tourism industry, the hospitality industry really sees an increase in its profits. And it also stimulates road building, because to get from A to B, you need roads, you need better roads, and so it provides jobs in road building as well. Now, laissez-faire, individualism and protectionism. So I'm not going to go into massive detail about the 3 presidents that were in power during this time, but it is important that you do know about them. So if you could, after this, to add some more to your work, go to this website here. This will give you a great insight into the 3 different presidents in a little bit more detail than I'm going to go into here. So we've got Warren Harding in 1921 to 1923. His motto was return to normality after the First World War. He also brought in the Ford-Niebuhr Act, and he brought in protectionism, which we'll look at in a sec. Calvin Coolidge, America's business is business, and he believed in laissez-faire. And then Herbert Hoover at the end, who believed in rugged individualism, and we'll look at what all these mean in a second. But again, if you could, at the end, go to this website and have a look at these 3 presidents, you'll get a lot more information for your revision notes. So laissez-faire. Calvin Coolidge, as we've just discussed, motto was the business of America is business. And he believed that the government should be involved as little as possible in the day-to-day running of the economy. He left businesses alone to make decisions, thinking that this would result in high profit, more jobs, good wages, and it did for a little bit as well. There was low taxes, there was few regulations, which meant that there was little interference. And actually, during his presidency, the American economy went through a period of unparalleled growth. It had never grown so quickly. Coolidge himself is a self-made millionaire, and he's an example of what could be achieved in the USA by hard work and little government interference. And this is what we call laissez-faire. So basically, the government interfering as little as possible in the day-to-day running of the economy. Then we've got individualism. Now, again, Herbert Hoover believed in rugged individualism. This basically means that people achieve success through their own hard work. That's all that means, really. And protectionism. After 1919, after the First World War, the America returned to what it believed was isolationism, so we'll look after ourselves. And the Republicans put tariffs on imported goods, meaning that anything that was coming in from foreign countries had huge fines, not fines, but huge taxes on them, meaning that it was expensive to buy these in the USA then anyway, and it encouraged the purchase of American goods. Harding actually brought in the Ford-Niebuhr tariff, which is really important, you should get this down, that's raised import duties on goods coming into the country to the highest level ever, protectionism, American industry, and encouraging Americans to buy home-produced goods. So it basically meant that foreign goods in the country was so expensive to buy because there was such high taxes on them coming in that Americans would be encouraged then to go and buy home-produced goods because they were a lot cheaper. There's also a reduction in income tax rates, which left people with more money to spend on the economy on home-produced goods as well. So did everybody prosper during this boom? In short, no. Farmers in particular grew too many crops, couldn't sell them, ended up having to sell their farm. In 1924 alone, 60,000 farmers lost their farms. Black Americans also didn't prosper. They were still treated really badly. They had the worst paid jobs. In the South, they were still segregated. The KKK was prospering, unfortunately, during this time. Immigrants as well, still high unemployment. There was not much demand for coal miners. not much of a demand for shipbuilders and textile workers as well, because of the new synthetic, easily made textiles that had come into be during the 1920s. Textile workers also lost their jobs quite a lot as well. So not everybody prospered, and these are the groups that prospered. And if you go and look on BBC Bitesize, it'll give you a little bit more information about these as well. So who benefited? Owner of consumer goods factories, assembly line workers, white people in the cities, stock market speculators. The early immigrants did benefit, middle class women and builders. Who didn't benefit? Farmers, sharecroppers, black people, people in rural areas, coal miners, textile workers, and the new immigrants. Okay, so basically some people benefited, some people didn't. Overall though, there was a huge boom in the American economy during the 1920s, and that can't be denied. That's it for key question 4. Thank you very much for listening. I will see you next time for key question 5.